Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this incredibly critical and vital panel discussion in association with our exhibition, An Elegy to Rosewood. My name is Amy Galpin, and I'm the Chief Curator here at the Patricia and Philip Frost Art Museum. I want to say a few things about our exhibition. It's up until the end of April, and it is going to travel to the Hannibal Square Heritage Center in West Winter Park, and so we're really thrilled about that. There's also a lot of additional resources on our website. So if you go to frost.fiu.edu and you look under exhibitions and find an Elegy to Rosewood, you're going to find a lot of historic documentation and testimonies, some of which are from the artists about their research process. This exhibition is a part of the Martin Luther King Jr. exhibition series, which addresses issues of race, diversity, social justice, civil rights, and humanity to serve as a catalyst for dialogue and to enrich our community with new perspectives. We are grateful to the Knight Foundation for its generous support of this exhibition through a Knight Arts Challenge grant. This exhibition has also been made possible with generous support from the Green Family Foundation. Additional funding was provided by a grant from Florida Humanities and FIU's College of Communication, Architecture, and Arts, African and African Diaspora Studies, and we also extend our gratitude to the Center for Women and Gender Studies for their involvement with this exhibition. This is surely an exhibition that is the product of many voices, and one of those voices that we centered in this exhibition was Lizzie Robinson Jenkins, who is a descendant of survivors of the Rosewood Massacre. As Lizzie often likes to say, history, it's who we are. And that was such a guiding principle for us in our exhibition, and I hope will be a guiding principle that will continue to inform the work we do at the Frost Art Museum. This show would not have been possible without the input of Dr. Alex Cornelius and also my colleague Yadi Rivero, our assistant curator. Both Yadi and Dr. Cornelius wrote the majority of the texts that you read in the exhibition, and I'm really proud of the work that they have done. Without any further ado, I'm going to hand it over to our assistant curator, Yadi Rivero.
Hello. Testing. Okay. Good evening, everyone. As Amy said, my name is Yadi Rivero. I'm assistant curator here at the Frost Art Museum, and I'm very eager and honored to be presenting our panelists and moderator for tonight. First, we have our moderator, who is Dr. Tameka Hobbs. Tameka Bradley Hobbs is a historian, educator, author, and activist. Her professional experience includes work in both higher education and public history institutions. Between 2011 and 2018, Hobbs served as assistant professor of history, chair of the Department of Social Sciences, and university historian for Florida Memorial University, and has since held several leadership roles across various academic institutions in Florida in programs dedicated to African American studies. Hobbs has written 3 history books focused on racial tensions in Florida, including her 2015 publication, Democracy Abroad, Lynching at Home, Racial Violence in Florida. Dr. Hobbs is the library regional manager for the African American Research Library and Cultural Center in Fort Lauderdale. Next, we have Chire Regans. Artist Chire Regans, also known as Vanta Black, has an art practice deeply embedded in social justice and community empowerment and healing. Over the past decade, Chire's work has focused primarily on social advocacy and amplifying the voices of distinct community members. In 2022, her site-specific installation, To What Lengths, appeared in the Museum of Contemporary Art, North Miami's Public Plaza. Her work is currently on display at the African American Research Library and Cultural Center in the show Walls Turned Sideways Are Bridges, Narratives of Need. Next is Rhea Leonard. Born and raised in South Florida, Rhea Leonard incorporates drawing, printmaking, and sculpture within her art practice. She explores topics highlighting the Black body and dissecting the Black experience through her detailed and poignant figurative works. She received her MFA from Florida International University. And her BFA from the University of Florida through New World School of the Arts College. She is currently a resident artist of the Bakehouse Art Complex and teaches drawing here at FIU. This is the fourth time Rhea's work has been presented at the Frost, and she is a past recipient of the Betty Laird Perry Award. Moving along, we have Charlisa Montrope. Through her work, Charlisa Montrope creates a hybrid visual language that allows her to explore heavy layering in contemporary printmaking. Through the combination of different printmaking techniques, such as jelly plate printing and silkscreen, she reflects the multiple cultures she experiences as a Caribbean immigrant. She also uses digital media and traditional drawing processes such as soft pastel, airbrushing, and acrylic painting. In 2022, she had 2 solo exhibitions at the University of Miami Gallery and at the Bonnier Gallery. And last but not least is Tori Scott. Tori Scott is a multidisciplinary artist based in Miami, Florida. She received her BFA from FIU with, I'll do it every time, with a focus in studio art and a minor in art history in 2020. Her art examines the Black experience in both the private and public spheres. Taking photos of subjects and adding them to a personal archive, Scott explores the merits of preserving memory and celebrating Black life. In 2022, she was a recipient of the Betty Laird Perry Award here at FIU, and recently she was an artist in residence at Project Art Miami, where she taught art principles to elementary and middle school children. All the artists in this panel created artwork for this exhibition, and please join me in welcoming our panelists.
Thank you, Yadi. Thank you, Amy. Thank you, everyone, for being here this evening. It is an honor indeed for me to serve as moderator for this panel with these wonderful, wonderful artists. But I would like to start with a moment of silence for the lives and the loss that brought us here tonight. Please join me in silence as we remember the victims of the Rosewood massacre. Thank you. Very important that we center that, and that's what the show has done when we talk about an elegy to Rosewood, a remembrance of words, and in this case, art, to those people who lost their lives, specifically in those who were impacted through this incident of racial violence. And of course, this year represents the 100th anniversary of that tragedy here in the state of Florida. I'm a daughter of the state of Florida. I grew up north in Suwannee County, have ended up with a career reflecting on and recording the history of this state, particularly when it concerns racial violence. And it's so painful and so plentiful at the same time. And I'm grateful finally that we're at a point where these and all the other tragedies, the ones that I write about and others, can receive a public airing. And some of the burden that over the decades has been borne solely by Black residents in this state in particular can begin to be shared with others. But that's one side of the pain, and what we'll talk about tonight will be a reflection on both the pain and the promise and the beauty that can come out of the recording and the reflection. I do want to talk about tradition keepers and the way that these artists tonight have helped to keep that tradition alive. And so I wanted to start with each of you by asking how you came to know about. Can you remember the first time that you heard or began to understand what happened in Rosewood? And since you're holding the mic, Chire, I'll start with you.
It's really hard for me to pinpoint exactly when I became aware of the massacre at Rosewood. I think study of blackness and the history of black folks in America started for me in college because that's when I started to learn the history of black people. And I went to HBCU, Florida A&M University.
Whoop whoop.
A.
Rattlers in the house. All this FIU business. Let's give them some rattlers in the house.
No, stop. So being there at an institution dedicated to elevating black students, I started to learn so much. And I remember being overwhelmed at just the history of black folks in America and having to incorporate that into my practice. I felt like I needed to do that. And there wasn't a specific moment. There's just a summation of that experience.
We have that in common. That's pivot changed my major to history because of the knowledge I received in my history courses at an HBCU, Florida Memorial. School of Business and Industry. I was supposed to go through SBI. I wanted my master's of business administration, but freshman year I took some classes and had a simultaneous reaction, which was inspiration and excitement. I was also very angry as a 19-year-old that someone somewhere in the office made a decision that I didn't need to know the stuff that I really needed to know. And I had to find it on my own, which makes so much of the debates that are taking place right now very painful. But Charlisa.
You were just projecting. Now it is on. Okay, so honestly, I am an immigrant. I came from the island of St. Lucia, so my first time hearing about the Rosewood Massacre was when Amy emailed me about this project. Um, I can't say I learned a lot about Black history in school outside of Martin Luther King, Malcolm X. I don't know a lot about Florida history, so it was like a deep dive for me. I'm like, I need to know more about this. I ended up making it a family thing. I had my mom and my siblings travel to Rosewood with me. I'm like, I need to see what's there. I need to know about um, what happened just so that I'm honest when I'm telling the story. Um, so, yeah, my first time hearing about it was when Amy emailed me, and I just went into like deep dive research. I'm like, I have to be on the land. I have to research. I went up there. I took pictures of the house. I met with Lizzie whilst I was up there. So, yeah, it was a very new experience for me, and it also made my mind start to think like, how much more of this knowledge am I missing out on? I was raised here in Florida, but still I stuck to more of my Caribbean roots, even though that I'm here. So I can't say I know a lot about Floridian history or even African American history in general.
So for me, I can say I remember watching the film, but I was like younger, like elementary school age, so I didn't know much about it. And then with doing research and watching the documentaries about the survivors, it was very overwhelming, of course, but it felt familiar because things like this happened before, quite too often. So yeah, I kind of learned more about it, like with doing the project and working with my artwork.
I would say Rosewood came onto my radar when Amy met with me in my studio and asked me to do a commissioned artist book. I had never heard of Rosewood. I'd probably heard of it as a town as somewhere else, not in Florida. So I was very surprised when I started my research and realized it was here. And just the sickening feeling that, oh my gosh, this is a contagion of this country. Like, this is yet again reads almost word for something that happened in Tulsa, in other things, in other communities that we'll probably never know about because it's just not in white supremacy's advantage for it to be part of our history. And like the other artist said, just thinking, how much do I not know? How much of my history will I never know? And even if I wanted to dig, wanted to continuously be a historian, to dig as much as I could. It was something that stuck out to me when I was working on my book. I was wondering where the truth was, and just trying to figure out conflicting stories between one source and another, and just realizing, even now, as we see in our streets today, how someone can get gunned down by the police, but they'll tell one story, but the family will say there's no way that happened. And then we're literally finding out over the course of social media and the news, the story is not what we were first told. And literally that's what I thought about with Rosewood. Where's the truth? Where is it lying? And sadly, I was kind of resigned to the fact that I might never know. So I wanted my book to be a discussion with that uncertainty.
That is very powerful, and I'm really struck by what you shared, Rhea, in that the conflict and the truth. My book on 4 lynchings in North Florida was very much about that. It was an interrogation of both the records that were left by white institutions, white newspapers with white journalists, by white officers of the court, white policemen. Those records were limited. They assumed and presumed the guilt of the black parties involved. These were 4 black men, one black boy. And it was pretty much devoid of the stories of the black people, of the families, of the communities. And I was able to correct that using oral history, sometimes with survivors, sometimes with other family members, community members, and allow for those 2 things to exist in tension. We do have obligations as scholars to only proceed with what we can document, but it was a major corrective to the record to have the perspective of black people brought forward. And I'm so grateful to Lizzie Robinson Jenkins. Her name has been invoked several times here tonight. She is the reason why we're here, and the work that she is doing to preserve the legacy of those victims of Rosewood, and always centering their experiences. I want to come back to that a little later as we talk about the role, particularly of women, as tradition keepers. I think that is a very important theme in the work. But I wanted to start in reverse order this time. Now that you've talked about your introduction, I'm fair. Nothing else unfair. In reverse order to talk about, yes, you've acknowledged when you heard about Rosewood, but I want to know how Rosewood influenced the art that you've contributed to the show.
Chire and I were kind of talking before we met up, and then we were just kind of talking about how, as artists, you typically go through a process, and I was very interested in the fact that a lot of us had ideas going in, but we allowed the process or our ongoing research to further evolve the books that we actually ended up making. And Rosewood has become not only an influence to me, but my entire practice. I don't even approach drawing the same way, because I think there was a question that we were asked, where we were asked to give like certain questions to Yadi, the curator, and asking us to think about our process and kind of reflect on it. And I just literally sat there and thinking, wow, I have to hold myself more accountable. I have to dig deeper. Like, I know that I went to a certain level of a little bit of depression working on my book, but Rosewood, it's a reality, and it's not a reality that we can shy away from. And as a black person, we really don't get the space to disengage from our trauma. We don't get the chance to just ignore it, because we walk around with it every day. It happens to us literally every day. So Rosewood, I'm gonna carry it forever, even though I'm not a descendant of the community. I'm from miles away, centuries in the past. I feel separated from it, but at the same time, I want to be a storyteller as well. So when people ask me about this piece that'll now live on in my archive of works, I'll happily be able to tell them about this story that I know now, and hopefully share the burden of the storytelling.
And so your contribution is Message for the Next. Can you talk a little bit about your intentions with that piece?
I went about my book in more of a sense of being confrontational to us as a society now, and charging us here as contemporaries how we deal with racial violence. And I wanted the loss of that community and the hurt and the pain that was visited upon those innocent people. I needed it to be felt by us. And I know we come to museums to take in content, to take things away. So by denying certain aspects of my book, or opening a book and not having anything on the page, or having it washed, weared away, I needed us as contemporaries now to understand that we've been robbed of this history. That even though we are not a part of Rosewood, there's probably stories, histories, lives, family, people that could have affected our society, our country as a whole, and they'll never have that opportunity. So even though this was violence that visited 100 years ago, it still reverberates with us because it's literally wiped out anything that we could glean or they could have given us and that we could take on and further into the future. So I would want racial violence to not just be some other community's problem or the history's problem. It's our problem too.
Tori, could you speak to the piece that you have in the show and what it represents?
Okay, so going into making my art, I had different ideas. I wanted to go into different directions because there is so much to unfold here. But I kind of was able to narrow down what I wanted to speak about. So my piece represents a church scene. So I wanted to choose something that is very familiar. Yeah, right there. So I wanted to, explore an idea that is familiar and relatable around the board. So I kind of addressed two conversations with my piece. On one hand, I talk about how a lot of infrastructures and buildings, specifically churches, were targeted, through violence. We can think about, how they used to burn the crosses on the lawns, or the church bombing that happened in Birmingham, or even in more recent years, the church shooting in South Carolina. And just thinking about that and how that kind of occurs and repeats itself throughout our history. And then on the other hand, I address the fact that the community were able to take those teachings and their beliefs and their lessons from this space, and they were able to overcome those things. And I think that that's powerful within itself. Again, working with this piece, it was very overwhelming, really understanding what happened and what went on, and the fact that the survivors didn't talk about this. Like, a lot of their families didn't know that this even happened and that they were a part of it. So, I couldn't help but to feel connected to it because I am a Black woman, and that could have been me if I was, living during that time. That could have been my grandmother or, any of our ancestors. So it was a very deep point for me, and I feel like this is one of the most meaningful art pieces I've ever created, honestly. Yeah.
Charlisa.
Okay, so initially when I was approached with this book, my first thought was, I am an immigrant. I'm not a African American. How can I be truthful to this story? I'm like, I was telling my mom, the only thing I have in common with this is that I'm Black, but I'm not African American Black. And she was like, okay, but still do it. You'll see where it can go from this. And in my work, I use maps. So that's why I had to travel to Rosewood. I wanted to document my journey there, and I wanted to feel what it was like to be in that space. When I got there, I was a little bit underwhelmed because I know they said they wiped everything out, but I didn't think they really wiped everything out. There was literally just the house, that was the Rosewood house now, that sits there where a lot of the people fled to and were hidden in the well, in the attic, which is why I have the title, Don't Look in the Well. As I was reading, I noticed that they said people were hidden in the well, and I was taking pictures, but in the moment I just wanted to be in the land, so I didn't really realize until I went back on my pictures that the well was still there, which kind of gave me goosebumps when I went back and looked at my picture. I'm like, wow, this is really significant. In also doing my research, because I use maps a lot, I ended up going to special collections at the University of Miami, and I stumbled upon a map of Florida from 1837. On that map, there was Cedar Key, and Cedar Key is one straight shot from Rosewood. And in alignment to Cedar Key, there's no Rosewood, but there's Negro Town. So I took that map and I brought that into my research. I overlaid it on top of the map of my journey and maps that I found of Rosewood online. Going back to the well, I decided to handwrite the names of the lives that were lost during the massacre. So, yeah. And for me, it's such a heavy thing in history in Florida. That's why I kind of just kept going as far as the length of the book. The book is 42 feet unfolded. It's not as long as my MFA book, but almost there. And I was just thinking about how heavy this is. Even though it's a very small book in size, it's still massive in length. So
I just want to uplift a couple of things that I'm taking away from listening to you. I think that while your story is a story of immigration to the U.S. and kind of being brought into this history, I think about the survivors also being forced to, in a different way. You leave by choice sometimes, you leave by force sometimes. They too become, they have to create new lives for themselves wherever they end up. And that is not an uncommon story. In the case of Rosewood, in the case of Ocoee, in the case of the lynchings that I look at, yes, there are victims who are killed, but the survivors often have to recreate new lives for themselves in new places. And it leads to this disbursement of family that is very disconcerting, very destabilizing for folks. So I think that that's a parallel as well. And I think the other piece too, when we talk about Caribbean descendant folk coming to the United States and dealing with Black American folks, we're not going to sit here and pretend that there aren't tensions between the communities. But what I always drive at and appreciate is, in order for many of you all to come over here, we had to survive and create the conditions which allow you to thrive in this society, and that deserves a level of respect, what I hear in you now that you've had a chance to dive into it a little bit more, and empathy, frankly. And I want to talk later about the mental impacts, not only of what you all have experienced, but for us as a community as well. The responsibility for holding these memories, not being able to share these memories, what that has meant for us. And sometimes, I don't want to paint with a broad brush, that also manifests in self-destructive behaviors in our community. And so there needs to be a level of understanding of what we have come through as a minority, numerical minority population in this country, compared to the experiences of other people. And I think these types of stories allow for the creation of that type of understanding. But I love your description and your work. That's beautiful. Vanta Black.
I remember when Amy approached me about this project, and I knew why she approached me. I just didn't know what she was going to speak about. So when she said Rosewood, I was like, oh my God. Because the nature of my work is already heavy. I focus on almost what happens after a tragedy and who it happens to and who I talk to after that, and in the process of making the art, right? So I was like, oh my God, Amy. But I appreciated the fact that she thought of me. And then when she told me all the artists were Black women, I was like, oh my God. Because this is unheard of. Just us sitting here. It's like I feel like I can exist in this space because we exist together. So I want to extend my gratitude for you for being intentional about who you approached because you understood the impact that we would make in this space. So, um, me and Rhea were talking earlier about the process and what is required. And I said to her, look, there were so many people that asked me, what are you working on in the process of thinking about this book and what I was going to do? And I was like, you know what? I don't really want to do the labor with them. I'm working on a book for an exhibition at FIU. And then in some conversations, I was like, here is what this book is going to be about. You know, find out what happened here. So all of this has been a journey. I knew I wanted to focus on remembrance and I wanted to center Lizzie because Amy said that she wanted to center Lizzie. And it's not often that Black women are centered in stories. And their voice isn't often heard. So we met with Lizzie via Zoom last year. And after having that conversation with her about her experience, and we were in her home with her, and all of these artifacts just all around, and her recounting what happened, I was like, I have to focus on remembering the power of Black women, legacy, and tradition in this book. So it was a process to really decide what I was going to do and how I was going to do it. And I was also telling Rhea that my practice evolved in the year that we were preparing for this exhibition. So I was able to work with different materials and then decide, oh, I'm going to use these materials for this book. So it all kind of happened the way it needed to because it was a journey for me. And I hope that anyone who looks at the work sees the work as a journey because there are 3 generations of sisters depicted in this book. And so you have to think about all of the stories that they told one another, how it's being passed down, and how that's done culturally for us.
Perfect setup for my next question. So you might as well hold on to the mic because I'll start with you.
Lord! You gotta go back and move it.
Black women have always seemed to have this distinct role as memory keepers in our family and our community, and you just spoke to that. We've had an essential role in keeping and passing down elements of our culture like genealogies, recipes, tradition, and wisdom. And in the case of Lizzie, passing down the memories of a particular tragedy. How has that shown up in your lives, in your family, and in your work?
It is a cornerstone of my work. Tradition, there's so much of what I was taught in my work. And given that the nature of the work that I do is rooted in a traumatic event, I still want to focus on remembrance and legacy. And I'm very specific about how I depict it in my work because it's in my journey as an artist, I've always been the one to speak about my experience as an artist. And it's I think speaking to Lizzie and understanding the impact of your memories and your words and speaking about your experiences, how that affects others, it was a reminder to me. And it is, I need to do it in my work. I have to. It's what's important to me. And over the past year, my work has evolved into traditions like hair braiding and how that is passed down culturally. And I included it in the book because I knew that anybody who saw that would get it. If it happened, if you know, you know. You know, if this is something that's passed down in your family, you're gonna see it right there. And I'm trying to say things without having to say them. in the work. And
Hair braiding is brilliant. I have so many memories of being between my mother's knees as a girl and having my hair done, and I think that's particular to Black Americans and what we do. Probably one of my biggest regrets and the little small dent in my Black card is I didn't have any younger female relatives around me, so I'd never really learned how to cornrow, and it's a minor badge of
give me that
shame.
card. We need the card. We need the card.
But I had sons who were, my oldest in particular was very into hair, and I used to try and struggle on his head. I had to enlist the backup to come whenever the grandmothers came. Could you please braid them down real quick? But that's real. That's
real.
one of many pieces of tradition that are vivified in your work. So thank you for that, Charlisa. For you, Black women as tradition keepers.
Just to piggyback off of what you said, I can't cornrow either. My mom, I still got to sit between my mom's legs every time to get my cornrows. But as far as tradition keepers, in my work, and when I first started off my grad program, I was searching for my why, and it kept going back to family and culture. So I use my maps as me rediscovering the island of St. Lucia. I left at the age of 3. And the first time I went back was for a funeral, and I didn't get to explore much. The second time I went back was for another funeral, so I didn't get to explore much. And the third time I went back for leisure, I fell in love. I'm like, this is what they took me away from. I always tell my mom she kidnapped me. I'm like, why would you take me away from this? And in retrospect, I do think it was for the better, but just being able to go home, I actually just came back on Monday. I'm rediscovering the land. I'm using maps as that for that process. Whenever my mom asks me where I'm at, I'm like, I don't know how to pronounce this, but this is where I'm at. I haven't gone to places that she hasn't even been to on the island. So that, and then I get to spend more time with my grandmother telling me stories. She crochets, so she passes down doilies, and I made artist books out of that idea and that tradition. I made a set of doilies that I laser cut. So that was kind of like in the beginning of like my artist book journey. I always liked making books since undergrad, and then they started to have some kind of structure and become things on their own within my prints. And yeah, so for me, as far as holding tradition, like I said, as an immigrant, we still stay close to our family's tradition. In America, Sundays we still cook I told my mom we had to stop a few years ago, but we would still cook the same meals that we would normally cook back home. And after a while, I'm like, okay, we can switch it up a little bit, but we always go back to that. Family is a very important thing to me, so I keep them near and dear, and I like to keep hold of the stories they tell me, the traditions. I'm actually in the process of wanting to learn how to crochet, because once my grandmother is gone, who's going to do it for us? So that's the next thing on my list to learn how to do, and hopefully I can also make books out of that.
So for me, as far as traditional keepers, I can recognize that on both sides of my family. When I was younger, I noticed that it was always the women that, were like the head of everything, whether it was like family get togethers, reunions, knowing family histories, knowing family secrets. It was always the women who were, like the keepers of that. And in our families, like the matriarch are, always cherished because they keep the families together. And as far as passing things down, I can remember when I was younger, me and my sister, we would spend hours going through like my mom's collection of family photos. And that was fun to us because we were making connections with these photos, with the places, the people, even if we haven't, met them because they passed away before we were born. We still had that connection because we had these archives. And that shows up a lot of my work because I start off with like photographing my subjects or, recreating photographs from the past. And I think that that is very important, the act of passing down things, generations to generations, because, if you don't have those oral histories, if you don't have culture, if you don't have, photographs or family heirlooms, what do you have? And I was able to kind of find my identity with using those things. So in my work, I talk about culture and family and memories, and I kind of bring those together.
The question again, it's been a minute. The question, I forgot, I've lost it.
So this is really about Black women as memory keepers in our families and communities, and how that takes place, and how has the tradition of Black women as memory workers survived in your family and in your work?
This is going to sound really interesting, but for a while, I noticed that the Black women in my family are the ones that keep the traditions, but I never knew what my tradition keeping was or my charge or duty. And it was very interesting, just that conversation coming back to Miss Lizzie, that literally just changed everything. It was like my entire world was rocked, and just hearing her speak about wanting to hear the story from her mother and just having that moment of realizing the story kind of chose her. It's like calling out to her, like, I need you to ask to hear me again because I'm choosing you to be the person to herald it. And then ever since, I've been thinking about, because my work, I think about my artwork as in service of my ancestors. I would not be here without those who made harder struggles than I've ever had to, than sitting in an academic space writing papers. So when I make work, I try to leave space for things that they would want me to tell out in my work. And similar to what Tori said, photos, I'm sitting here thinking about what could be my thing, but I think photos might be my thing. And as painful as it is sometimes, I think I did it recently because my aunt just passed maybe a few years ago, and something just told me, go look at the photos. And I literally just found photos that hadn't been touched in years. And I made my cousin cry that day. I was sending it in the family group chat. Everyone was getting emotional, but there was just something about the photos wanted to be shown. And I was like, I didn't understand why, but in thinking about it, making that connection, maybe someone wanted to be remembered that day. So I felt happy pulling those photos out, even if I made people cry. The happy memories were in there along with all the others. So, yeah. So, I'm sorry. No. So, I'm sorry. But I just keep coming back to that conversation with Miss Lizzie and just being reminded of having to be authentic to whatever your calling is, and being reminded of what it is you're meant to do. And even though sometimes it gets tough answering your call, you kind of have to do it because no one else can do it but you. And this project, again, is literally just going to stick with me because it helped renew my love for art. Because just being in that Zoom call, it just spoke to me so deeply. It's like that message was meant for me that day. So I had to have been in the right place at the right time, doing the right thing to have heard it. So I'm like, just keep it going. I'm just going to keep it going.
Wow, that's really powerful. And what's coming to me, number one, is just a lot of kinship in terms of what's being told. And especially with your comments, Rhea, this work is not for everybody. It is a calling. Not everybody gets it, but there has to be someone who collects, who archives, who preserves, who reaches back, who understands the concept of Sankofa, so that whenever those who don't get it now decide that they want to go look for themselves, that there are those elements, there are those pieces. I'm struck in this moment, and I want to call the name of Jackie Thornell. Jackie Thornell just made one of the most significant gifts to the African American Research Library and Cultural Center that we've probably had in our 20 years of opening. A couple years ago, a year before last, she donated to us 1,300 photographs that she had been collecting intentionally of Black people. in situations other than poverty and dismay, because she was upset that that was all that she was seeing. And these works are absolutely enchanting and beautiful. They cover a time period from roughly the mid 19th century all the way through the mid 20th century. The number of them, the breadth of them is such a labor of love and intentionality. And you can visit these if you search for the Love Thornell Black Photography Collection at AARLCC. You'll find them. About 700 of the 1,300 images have been digitized. And they're primarily of Black women. And so I count her too in this legacy of memory keeping and moving things along. I want to talk about this though, because along with the obligation comes the weight. Unfortunately, the history of Black people generally, right, in this country on these shores, and even throughout the Americas, whether we talk about the global South or the Black Atlantic, is one that is always colored, frequently colored by pain. Pain is not all that we are. There's so much beauty, so much creativity, so much survival, so much love, but we have had to contend with the realities of racism and white supremacy as it shows up in the attacks on our bodies. And then as Black women, the specificity that comes with that. When you think about the fact that a white community destroyed Rosewood simply because of an allegation that a white woman was raped, that for many of those men, they felt that they were fully justified in what they had done because there had been a violation to white womanhood. But conversely, understanding that not then or now do Black women enjoy that type of protection, that type of reverence, that type of respect for our womanhood. These are very difficult burdens for us to bear. So I want to talk about mental health. I want to talk about self-care. I want to talk about how each of you as artists in doing this work, even as you process this show, how have you taken care of yourselves to keep doing the work? And I'm going to stop picking on Rhea and Vanta, and I'm going to start with Tori this time.
So for me, of course, the topic of, Black communities, mental health, Black women, violence, is very, I don't know, I just get emotional when we talk about those things, but they do need to be talked about. I don't know. I can even think about a time when I was speaking to my mom about like the Rosewood and just going over some of the details, and she was kind of like, "Yeah, I don't want to hear anymore because we've heard this so many times," and that reminded me of a time when she told me that when the movie Roots came out, they watched it as children, but my grandparents couldn't because they weren't that far removed from that incident, and that was something that they just could not see visually. And even now, like I can't, watch movies like that because I don't know, I feel like if that was me, like how would I process, what would my mentee be like, what would I be thinking in that moment? And like, again, I think it is very important for mental health and to work on that because, in some spaces I do feel like, I'm a little uncomfortable because I may be like the only Black woman there, or like in a lot of art space, sometimes I am the only Black artist there. So just feeling like I belong, like I had to tell myself like I belong here and, I'm just as good as everyone else in the room. And I kind of have to process that, myself because sometimes I feel like, well, wow, like, no one here can relate to me. And it's all about relatability and feeling comfortable within myself. And I can, I guess I can explore that through my art, because in my art I talk about culture and, things like that. So yeah.
So I definitely agree with Tori as far as being the only Black artist in the room majority of the times. I went to the University of Miami, which is a PWI, and fortunately for me, there was another Black Caribbean artist that was in a lot of the shows with me. But outside of that, I am normally the only Black artist in the. So I'm really grateful to be surrounded by Black artists today. And secondly, as far as mental health, I think my self care process is sharing the burden. So, Shire talked about not telling people what she was working on in the beginning. And I did the opposite of that, where any ear that would listen, I told them. I'm like, oh, I'm working on the Rosewood project for the Frost Museum. And they're like, what's Rosewood? And then I would just tell them about it. A few weeks ago, we had Tropic Bound, which was a book arts fair. I'm currently in residence at IS Projects, so I worked with them and I volunteered throughout the weekend. And a lot of the tables, as a volunteer, some people ask like, "Are you an artist?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I am. I do book arts. I actually have a book at the Frost Museum. So while you guys are in town, go look at it." And I told them about the exhibition, and a lot of them were like, "What is Rosewood? Where is that? What happened there? I'm sorry, I'm a little ignorant." And then when I told them about what happened, especially because most of the people that were tabling were white, they were kind of like, "I'm so sorry," like immediately wanting to apologize. And I'm like, just research it, look it up. You don't have to apologize to me, but you can share the story and know about the history, right? So, yeah. And I, even when my parents aren't listening, I still talk. So, they don't have a choice but to hear what I have to say. My mom could be falling asleep on me, and I'm like, "Hey, please, I'm talking. I'm sharing this story with you." So, I continuously go on and I tell the story, and I I force other people to carry the weight with me.
Um, this is a question I get a lot, um, because the nature of my work is heavy. I'm dealing with heavy subject matter. I'm telling very difficult stories, and I confront people with those stories. So, throughout this journey of continuing to focus on these things in my work, I've decided to own this responsibility and also own when I need to take a step back from this responsibility. And I'm really thankful that I have a squad of fellow creatives that understand this journey because their work is similar, and we've traveled this journey together, and we can talk to one another and then be really ridiculous with one another. That's one of them right there. When need be, because sometimes you need an emotional break from weight. You need to put the weight down for a second, then pick it up later. And when you have other people to have these conversations with, to share in joy and be like, look, let's talk about colors and bullshit for right now. Then go back to the real. That's what we do. Because we know that this work has to be done, but we need a break from it sometimes. And I remember when Amy approached me about this project, I was on an emotional hiatus because Lonnie and I had done some really heavy work in response to gun violence. And it took me a month to recover. I know it took her a month to recover from that. And then Amy called me. So I was like, I'm going to take on this responsibility. And because she knew that I needed to take it on, but I'm going to be very careful with how I speak about it. And I applaud you, sister, for doing the work for people in spaces, because I'd be like, look, I am not Google, you know, engaged with the work. So I applaud you for that. And it's a conscious choice that you make, just like you made that conscious choice, and you should be able to make that choice as a Black artist. And people should not always expect you to talk about certain things as a Black artist. as a black, and then that's another layer, a black woman artist. Then we talk about parents. I'm a black woman parent, so everything I'm thinking about the legacy I'm leaving, the legacy that was given to me, and how that comes through in my work.
Mental health, my goodness. I mean, my friends ask, hey, when are you going to see the exhibition? It's like, no, I just need to lay low. I just need to be introverted. I literally spent the weekend coming up with 5 images, and they're very difficult to look at. And people ask me all the time, man, your work is really powerful. Like, what's your process like? It happens in spurts. Because being the first viewer for some of the things that I create, it takes its toll. And there's things that I've sketched out, like I literally just can't bring myself to further them along because it's like I'm not emotionally ready to sit and draw this for 6 or so weeks. And you really have to just give yourself space to be okay with not always being on as an artist. And I know as artists, we kind of have to do all of our meet and greets, and we have to be in our studio and work and stuff, and then actually go to the other job that helps fund the passion. And just, I think it's been a mission for me, or a journey for me, to just kind of coming to terms with this calling that I have, and then coming with the reality that I'm a human being, that I'm not as young as I used to be. I'm not that young art student in high school that could go for like till 3 o'clock in the morning, wake back up at 5, hit the bus and go to class. I'm getting older, so this idea that my own expectations for myself need to mature as well. And mental health is no joke. I've seen friends burn out. I've been trying to been there at 3 o'clock in the morning when they can't sleep, when the insomnia hits, and it's like they're turning to harder stuff, and we're like, look, don't destroy yourself because it's a low point. And like, I completely agree with you. Having a network, having people that understand what your work is about, and then having someone tell you, like, maybe you just need to take a break. Maybe like having someone field for you when you're not at exhibitions, like, hey, and your name is brought up, they're like, they're taking a break, and then instead of you always having to answer those questions, and having friends that do that for you is just invaluable.
Yadi, how are we doing on time? Because I do want to open it up for questions for the audience. This time for questions now? Okay. All right, so we'll, I do have one more, but then I'll yield to see if there are any more from the audience. Does anyone have a question for our artist?
Hi, greetings everyone. Thank you so much for such a stimulating talk and for your presence. I found when I was working with some of the objects that I developed a new appreciation for the energy of objects, even though for the most part I was working with pictures, but I had been lucky enough to hear Ms. Jenkins talk about the objects. And so the cane, for example, she explained, which is something we see as something people use for support, at one point had also been used in self-defense. Or the iron, which is heavy and indicative of labor, was also indicative of pride of self and presentation. So I was wondering if in your work, when you were coming across and thinking about how you were going to represent different aspects of the survivors' experiences, if there were objects or things that seemed to portray one story, but that were also kind of like indicative of a hidden meaning or other layers of the same kind of story.
Yeah, that's right. So, so the well, for one, when you think of it as something you get water from on the daily, where they were using that to hide people, so they won't get caught by the KKK. I also think of the railroad being something like just industrial at the time, and it was used a lot, and it's very significant as far as the Underground Railroad and everything like that. People using that to flee, and that not being far away from where the Rosewood house is. Yeah, so those are the two things that come to my mind right away. I'm not sure if anyone else.
What comes to mind for me is a lot of the thought that I had about my artist book and thinking about books in general, where when you go to pick one off the shelf, you're expecting for things to be contained from cover to cover, be it a full narrative, be it actual information that you're seeking according to the binding on the book. It's not really visible with my book because of the way it's set up, but the spine of the book reads Rosewood Massacre with its date on it. And the original conception of the book was for it to be sitting in an altar, and it was meant to have this very grand setup. And I envisioned the viewer to be able to walk up and pick the book off the shelf and be greeted with the contents that have been tattered and destroyed, even though the outside of the book is pristine, well made, well crafted. And I also thought about how the book itself is an intimate exchange with the viewer as an object, where with my book, the way it's set up, it's when it's closed, it looks very flat, but it has an irregular shape. But opening the binding, the book will actually confront you as the viewer. It will come to sit forward, and it actually supports itself. It doesn't need you as the viewer to hold it. It will sit and confront you on whatever surface you have it set on, as you can see when you walk out. So having the book be something of a book that's kind of a passive thing that will lay on its own, but you typically, books require us to stay engaged for it to stay open. But this book, once you give it that initial kinetic energy of being open, it will stay open and continue to confront you. So that was something I was thinking about for my book.
Thank you so much for the work. Thank you so much for the panel. You talked a lot about gaps of information when it came to our histories. I'm Afro-Caribbean. Went to Colombia for the first time a few years back and had no idea that there was a large community of black people in Colombia. I grew up in the United States, so I kind of straddle two cultures, both my Afro-Latino culture and African-American culture. Interesting thing about being Caribbean in the United States and being black is nobody knows you're not African-American, right? It's not something that everybody assumes that that's what it is, so that's what you are when you're thinking about the grander perspective. In your journey, in your process of making this work, and doing your research and feeling those gaps of information, now that it's done, do you consider how you pass knowledge on? I'm sure as a parent, I'm sure, but how you pass the knowledge of these things on as you finish this work, as you finish this process, and as you move on to new projects?
You know what's really shaken how I communicate? Being a parent, and I have full understanding of the history of blackness in America, but then having to communicate that to a young person. I, I know that's right. I have a daughter who's 10, her name is Aaliyah. I have a son who's 12, his name is Cypher. So when they became old enough to ask me very specific questions, I had to and me and my homegirl talked about it because she's a parent also, how to navigate this conversation with things I understand, but having to have my baby understand things that don't make sense. And then feeling like I'm tripping because I'm making sense of some shit that don't make sense to my baby. And let me tell you about my son is extremely pragmatic, logical. 2 + 2 = 4. Mommy, that's blue. Mommy, that's red. No in between. And then having to find the in between and make an in between. My daughter is very creative, very emotional. She feels everything. So having to approach both of them, knowing those things about them, and feeling crazy because I got to rationalize some shit to them that's not rational. Thank you for that question. What did she do?
The reality was her sons were going to grow up in violent Black American culture. So her having to first translate all of that information and then be able to disseminate that information to her sons at very young ages.
Was it violent Black American culture or violent American culture?
Violent American culture, but specific to the way I have to walk through the world and the potential of violence against me, right? Growing up in New Orleans, growing up in the South here, right? With potential violence toward me from both sides of the line. Walking in my community and walking out of my community.
Mother of two Black boys, having a very adventurous now 17-year-old.
And who was just here recently for the holiday break and having conversations with me that he pushes back against. He wants his freedom, he wants to express, he wants to wear what he wants to wear. And, you know, I have to tell him, I got 30 years on you. So there may be some things that I know about this world that you may not know. I have a role to protect you. Can we listen a little bit? We end up talking a lot. I believe in talking to my kids. And to your point, there's a lot about racism that's just stupid and limiting and burdensome. And it's not that I've just started having these conversations with him. They've been happening as he got older. I've tried to be delicate based on where he was, but when they're transitioning, especially from being kind of these cute prepubescent kids, and now he's 6 feet tall, like, you gotta understand how people are looking at you and what's coming at you. And it's heartbreaking. It robs them of a certain level of innocence that I hate to do it every time I have to do it, but I'm more invested in his survival than I am his feelings. You'll be all right. We'll figure it out, because that's what we do. But you need this.
Already know something, and you're kind of obligated to tell them to make sure that they know correctly. So it's like you got to kind of dive into that conversation. You have to have it because they asked you. You know what I mean? So you can't deny them of that conversation. So it's just really.
It's interesting because you're really, you talk about legacy, right? And the legacy of Black women. I'm hearing my mom in everything you're saying now. And it's interesting because I've never really thought of, okay, yeah, you have to give the information, but the thing is dependent on where the child is, how you give that information, the how of it. I'm going to call my mom right when I leave here. I need to know more about that from her perspective.
And you know, when we were talking to Miss Lizzie, she spoke to us like we were her daughters. She was like, baby, and let me tell, and I just felt so embraced. And it's just something we do. We pass it on. And it was the first time she ever met us, and she spoke to us like we were family.
You're Amy? Oh, thank you, Amy, for everything. And thank you for taking her call, you ladies. Thank you for taking the call to take this work and for sharing it and just taking it. You know what I mean? Taking it and then giving it back in these forms that you guys do. It's amazing. I haven't seen everything yet, but just hearing you guys talk about it, and I cannot wait to see the work with this information. And my question was, how often were you thinking about the work? Like, how often would it be the first thing, or would that be the thing that wakes you up? Like, oh my goodness, like something wakes you up to do the work. What moved you to do the work? Hold up, I have to look at the question because, did you wake up wanting to do the work and your relationship to the work? Like, what was that for you guys? I know that was like 20 questions in one, but.
So I'm a planner, so I have to plan literally everything, every step out before I actually do something. So the work just lived in my head for months. When Amy approached me about this work, it was at the end of my graduate semester. So I'm like, okay, it's in my mind. Thank you. I went off to do a residency in New Mexico, and it was still like, it's there. I'm gonna get to it eventually. summer went by, I went back home to St. Lucia. I'm like, it's in my mind. I'm still thinking about it. Then when I came back, I'm like, okay, now I need to start doing the work. September came around and I applied for the residency at IS Projects and I got the key holder residence. So I'm like, okay, when I get to the studio, then I'm gonna start the work. I got the residency started October 1st. My birthday is October 4th, and that was also Miami Carnival weekend. I'm like, okay, after Carnival, after my birthday and Carnival, I'm gonna get to the work. So then I believe we took the trip before that. We took the trip in September. Yeah, we took the trip to Rosewood in September. So I had the images that I wanted to use. I had the screenshots of the maps. I had the ideas. They were living in my head for a while. And it was like, okay, now you have to do the thing. So the second step for me was like, okay, now let me prepare all my matrices as a printmaker. I'm doing an intaglio plate, so I'm like, okay, let me do an intaglio plate first. Let me prepare my screens first, and then once I do that, I can really do the work. So I did that, and then it sat there for a while. I had another project working on in around the same time, and that project was due before the artist book, so I'm like, okay, let me just do this first. So I did that, and then I'm like, okay, now back to my book. Pushed out everything, like I work on my pages as full sheets, then I cut them down, then I bind my book. So worked on that as a full sheet, cut down the book, and then I felt like I was kind of rushing because like the deadline was approaching. I did all this planning and then I'm like, oh, now I gotta hurry up. So did I wake up thinking about it every day? Yes. Because it just lived in my head for so long and I had an idea of what I wanted to do and I had planned it for so long. When I actually made the book, I'm like, oh no, my craftsmanship's not great. I'm like, I fucked this up so bad. I'm like, no. My book arts professor, Carol Todaro, I sent her pictures of the book. I'm also a New World alum. Yeah. Yes. So I sent her pictures of the book and I'm like, oh, this is not great. That's not great. And she's like, it's great. Like, don't worry about it. And I'm like, okay, weight lifted off of my shoulder. I'm like, okay, now they can pick it up. And I'm like, set it aside, I'm done. So yeah, I did think of it, lived in my head for a few months and the research and everything was just kind of there until the very end.
I would say for me, the project did consume me during the duration of me working on it. I did think about it every day because I had a lot of different ideas, you know, that I wanted to explore. And when I came up with this concept, I was satisfied, but at one point I almost burned down my studio because some of the objects I burnt them, like myself. And so it's just me outside with the flames just, I didn't know what I was doing, but once I completed it, I was satisfied. But I was concerned about how others would view it, you know, but then I had to realize, like, this is my work, this is what I want to talk about, what I want to address, and, you know, I'm going to present it in this way. But, yeah.
I didn't even think about it. I'm like, oh, I need this.
At least for me, I would say the same. The book lived rent-free in my head for at least 3 months, and I was like, I have a plan, I know what I'm gonna do, and like I feel confident in bookmaking, so I knew exactly what type of book I was gonna make, and then we had the conversation with Miss Lizzie, and it's like, it all changed, and I eventually knew I can't put this off anymore, because what I'm trying to do, I've never created a book like that. I had to troubleshoot it so many times. I think I scaled up mock-ups twice, and they worked when they were small, but the moment they got over like a foot, because I think the book is 19 inches total, the moment it went to 12, things just went wrong. And I was like, I don't have time for this to not work. So, and it was at a point where the book, I just didn't even take it to my studio. It just lived at my house with me. It was like a roommate that like I'd wake up and like 2 o'clock in the morning, I think I can make this work. I'm just sit down and try it for a few hours. And I just literally just, there were some days I was happy I could forget about the book, but then I knew when I forgot about it, it's like, oh, I can't forget about it. I have to go back to it. But it was, I think that book took me through my paces. Like it made me feel like an art student all over again, where you can plan, but the moment you get to like the 11th hour, it's like you have to pull an all-nighter, and I don't like doing that, but I was like, I can't sleep until I know exactly what I'm going to do, and I have to figure it out. And once I was able to figure out the binding and it would work, scaling it up was just a matter of like being patient with the ruler and cutting it and getting it to work. But that book really, I think it made me a better teacher, because then I can sympathize with my students when they have deadlines for me. And it's like, I understand. I was back there again. So I understand. I'll give you some grace, but don't work like that. I really don't recommend working like that, because when they were like, hey, we'd like some checks up, like progress photos of the book. And I was like, it's all paper, but I promise I have measurements. So my progress was really detailed, a lot of words, just a few photos. But I think a lot of my work I think my book really came together mid-October, but I'd known about it, thinking about it since May. So it was like really a concept most of the summer, even though I knew, but it was a lot. It was a different type of piece, yeah.
Thank you. Last question before we wrap up this evening. Again, thank you all for your brilliance. Thank you for your labor, emotional and otherwise. And I'm just really thrilled to meet you and get to see what you've done. What's your hope for your work, for Black women, and for us as a society as you consider and think about the legacy of Rosewood?
Well, I hope that we continue to be able to tell these stories accurately, because that is very important. A lot of times our stories are being told by outsiders. So the truths and the details get a little twisted. So being able to contribute to this story, no matter how overwhelming and, tragic it was, I was able to contribute, to the narrative of the Rosewood. And just being up here with these ladies, it feels really good. To have panel discussions and to create those conversations, because they need to be had. So yeah.
I think Tori said everything that I could, and she said it well. My hope is that I as an artist can continue to tell my truth and the truth of people that look like me, and it is received in spaces where people that look like me can exist. I hope that anyone else who undertakes a project like this does it just as responsibly as Amy did, because she made very specific decisions and she understood the power of those decisions. So that's what I took into account when I created this work, that I was tasked with this intentionally because she understood that it had to be us doing this work. Yeah, I hope that people receive that and understand the decisions that you make in spaces where the people being affected by those decisions may not be in those spaces, but you make these decisions with them in mind.
I think my hope would be, I think my hope would be that we have more people like you all who come show up and listen to us speak, to come see and engage with the work that we make. Because as artists, we can make our work all day, but our work takes its first breath when the second viewers see it, second, third, fourth, fifth. And then not only then, it starts to take on its own life when we start having conversations about said work. So I would hope more people come into these spaces that Amy has created, and that hopefully you go out into the world and invite more people in along with you next time. That's my hope.
Round of applause, please. That concludes our program.